One of the things that I find really fascinating about the Fates trilogy is how characters can have the same or nearly the same traits across all three games, and yet vary wildly in viability depending on the environment that they're in. While there are some characters who are actively nerfed or buffed between routes, like Niles and Odin showing up much later in Rev than Conquest, or Reyna getting extra stats in Rev as opposed to in Birthright, there's other characters who are just victims or beneficiaries of circumstance, without having anything concrete about them change. I touched on this point in my previous video about Mozu, and how she is pretty bad in Birthright, but has some genuinely good qualities in both the Conquest and Rev campaigns. But today's video takes a look at a character who kind of plays out like Mozu's opposite. Rinkah is a genuinely powerful tank in the Birthright route, and is able to leverage her weird stat spread alongside access to the Oni line to great effectiveness. In Rev, however, these qualities are a lot less desirable. Not only that, but a bunch of seemingly minor decisions around the campaign add up to put Rinkah at a disadvantage repeatedly, to the point where it almost feels like the development team actively hated this unit.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
So let's take a look at everything that went wrong with Rinkah in Revelation, and how she can potentially defy the odds in order to still become one of your carries. This video is part of an ongoing series with the goal to do a deep dive into every single playable unit in Fire Emblem Fates Revelations. Yes, even that one. Despite the fact that the game has a reputation for being terribly unbalanced, I truly believe that every member of the cast can contribute to your team. But units in Fates are highly customizable, and this goes doubly so for Revelations, where each cast member has new options that are not available on their native routes. And so my goal is to go over the multiple potential builds that every member of the roster has. That way, if you want to play through Rev on its highest difficulty, you can utilize whoever your favorite characters are. I'm not going to pretend that all of these units are equally viable. In fact, a secondary goal of the series is to come up with a Revelation tier list, but I really do believe that everyone is at least salvageable and can offer you something unique. While this series is going to be focused around the lunatic difficulty, much of what I say can also apply to the lower difficulties of hard and normal. Those difficulties have lower numbers for the enemies, so it's easier to reach stat thresholds, but things like various reclasses, available friendships, and specific builds that you can go into stay universal despite what difficulty you intend to play on. With all that out of the way, let's dive into our unit review. God, that's either the worst or best series name I've come up with. There's no middle ground. Rinkah starts as a level 4 Oni Savage, with rather unimpressive stats, both in the bases and growths department. The main standout is her 10 defense with a very good growth of 65%. Although this is held back a little bit by her low starting HP of 20 alongside an unimpressive 40% growth rate. Although with a base speed of 8 and a 55% growth rate, if given enough levels, Rinkah can get to the point where most enemies don't double her, and she actually doubles quite a few on her own. And this can supplement her bulk both because she takes fewer hits and because doubling builds guard gauge faster if you are in pair up. The rest of Rinkah's stats, both in terms of bases and growths, don't inspire much confidence. With only one more base strength than Hana and Kaze, and an equal strength growth to Kaze in Ninja, many suspect that Rinkah's abs are actually spray tanned on. Either that, or she just works out the defensive muscles, however that works. And one of the things that makes this comparison even more damning is Rinkah actually starts out in a class that has a decent strength modifier. In fact, the majority of her already unimpressive strength and HP bases and growths come purely from the class that she starts in. Although looking at her personal growth rates does reveal that Rinkah gets the majority of her speed and all of her skill, as well as I guess all of her luck and res, from her personal growth rates. This is potentially relevant because it means if Rinkah reclasses, she's not going to be getting much slower, and in fact can double down by reclassing into a speedy class. But if she does that, she's going to lose the majority of her already unimpressive strength, and her HP problem risks getting worse, potentially compromising her bulk, which is the one standout positive that Rinkah has going for her. As such, Rinkah's Heartseal class being Ninja feels like a cruel joke on the part of the developers. In any other physical unit's hands, this would be a godsend, as Ninja is one of the best classes in the Fates trilogy. But for Rinkah, it doubles down on her strength and HP issues, and her defense goes from being standout to just average. The one positive that Ninja does for Rinkah's stats is it gives her ridiculous speed. With 11 base and a 65% growth, she is certainly zooming. But I know there's a narrative in online Fire Emblem spaces that speed is the best stat, but I think Ninja Rinkah is a pretty good demonstration of why taking stats in isolation doesn't tell the full picture. Because we've taken someone who should be incredibly bulky and fast enough not to get doubled by most enemies, and turned her into a speed machine at the cost of everything that made her special. She deals less damage than she does than Oni, and those numbers already weren't impressive. She also is no longer able to choke a point like a good Doga archetype. In practice, we've just made 1-2 range Lyn. She doubles everything, but deals 0 damage, and 0 times 2 is still 0, at least last time I checked. But perhaps the funniest thing about Ninja Rinkah is despite the fact that she gives up all of these stats in order to get extra speed from the ninja class, she still is significantly slower than Kaze, with 1 less base speed and 20% lower growth. And Kaze is also going to be able to supplement his damage using weapon ranks, whereas Rinkah is still stuck at E daggers. Although, speaking of weapon rank, Rinkah's reclassing option is not the only area where her base kit appears to be screwed over, because her starting weapon rank is E, and this is a curse bestowed onto very few characters in the game. The only other units that start with E in their weapon ranks are Corrin, who has all of Branch of Fate to do 20 combats, Azura, who is a dancer and not meant to be doing combat, Mozu, who is a training project by default, and Sakura, who is a staff bot. E-rank staffs is unfortunate to her, but if she wants to be used long term, she's probably reclassing anyway. Having a low weapon rank is a detriment both because it means she can't use any stronger weapons than bronze, including things that are situationally useful like throwables and effective weapons, and because having a higher weapon rank gives you bonuses based on the rank that you have. So even if you are one of those people who thinks that using nothing but forged bronze weapons is the only way to play Fates, you still want your main combat units to have high weapon ranks in their weapons of choice. This is something that often comes up when talking about units like Kaze, who can supplement their shaky strength stat by having high weapon ranks. But Rinkah has the same strength problem that Kaze does, but she isn't given the weapon rank privilege that he is. Which is actually very funny because the map that she joins on, Rev 9, actually drops an iron club that was clearly intended to be used by her, but in most runs ends up being Gunter's personal weapon, at least until you get Camilla Squad. But speaking of Rinkah's join map, I should probably talk about her join situation. Because while she technically joins in the same chapter as Sakura, Tsubaki, Kaze, and Hana, she actually has a more unfortunate join situation than the group I collectively refer to as Sakura Squad. You see, while the other 4 units join you at the end of Chapter 8, Rinkah joins at the beginning of Chapter 9. This may not sound like a huge difference, but believe me, it is. It means that you are unable to arrange Rinkah's inventory in battle preparations, which includes the inability to give her any tonics in preparation for Chapter 9. One of the hardest maps in the early game. And not only that, but because Rinkah is not present in my castle, she's unable to get the positive attributes of meals from the mess hall. You also aren't able to access her inventory until the map begins, so if you want to forge a stronger weapon for her, you'll have to purchase 2 bronze clubs, as opposed to only purchasing 1 and being able to forge them together before entering Chapter 9. And even if she built a C support with one of the Branch of Fate characters, as often happens naturally due to the low number of units available in Chapter 4 and 5, She's completely unable to activate it, meaning she can't benefit from the increased support rank in Chapter 9. But perhaps the worst thing about joining in the start of Chapter 9 instead of the end of Chapter 8 is you are not required to play Chapter 9 immediately after Chapter 8. After you clear Chapter 7, 2 optional maps become available: Mozu's Paralog and Invasion 1. Both of these maps are pretty easy and make for excellent training opportunities for whichever units you plan on being the main combat squad in Chapter 9. Hana, Tsubaki, and Mozu need the experience the most, but even Kaze appreciates a few extra levels, which can be granted to him by going to Invasion 1 and Paralog 1 prior to taking on Fuga's Wild Ride. Rinkah, unfortunately, is unable to take advantage of these opportunities for experience, unless you delay them until after Chapter 9, which is something viable to do, especially if you care about support routing, but personally, I think makes Chapter 9 a lot harder than it needs to be. Speaking of which, let's take a look at how Rinkah stacks up against the enemies on her join map. At base, Rinkah performs quite poorly against the majority of the foes on Chapter 9. The Diviners are a bad matchup for her, and will be forever. She is modeled after Armor Knight, she's not meant to fight mages. But she doesn't fare much better against the physical enemies. With the Brass Club, she deals 0 damage to enemy Oni and Spear Fighters, and only 1 to the enemy Archer. In return, these enemies take a good chunk out of her. The enemy Oni deal more than 50% of her max HP in a single strike, and the Spear Fighters are not too far behind that. The Ninja and Samurai double and therefore 2-round Rinkah, and that's before factoring in the minus defense that Iron Shurikens will give to her. Now, Rinkah can shore up these matchups a little bit by using Fiery Blood. If she's at less than full HP, she gains plus 4 damage, functionally giving her another 4 strength. And that does allow her to deal single-digit damage to every enemy on the map. But she's also getting 2-rounded by most of them, so this really isn't a good situation for her. Of course, this is Fate's, stats are flexible, and even without meals and tonics available, Rinkah can get a pair-up from Great Knight Gunter, which helps shore her bulk significantly. Or you could spend your first action having her eat an HP tonic or a defense tonic, because it's not like she would be doing much with her player phased on turn 1 anyway. Still, no matter how you slice it, Rinkah is facing an uphill battle when it comes to Chapter 9. Although, she doesn't necessarily have to be, because I've been comparing her base combat to these enemies. But, because of Branch of Fate, Rinkah is not necessarily going to be at base. In fact, I think even if you don't focus on her, she's very likely to have gotten at least 1 level. A single level doesn't do much for her prospects. She's still dealing paltry damage, and she's still getting 2 or 3 rounded by every enemy on the map. But if you choose to focus on Rinkah during the 2 Branch of Fate chapters that she's available, it's possible to get 3 or even 4 levels worth of experience onto her. And just looking at her averages, this actually does a good deal towards her performance on the map. With 2 points of speed, the ninja no longer double her. 3 more points of defense is also a huge deal when it comes to the enemies who 2-round her. And 1 to 2 points of strength isn't much, but it is something. And if you get her to see enough combats to get D rank axes, then she can potentially use the Iron Club once it's dropped. But here's where we find out the next devious trick that the developers pulled on Rinkah. Because while she does technically have 2 Branch of Fate chapters available, leveling her up in Chapter 5 is pretty ill-advised. You see, Chapter 5 is entirely composed of 2 enemy types, those being mercenaries and dark mages. Both of these enemies have weapon triangle advantage over Rinkah, because they have red weapons and Rinkah's clubs are considered green. The weapon triangle in Fates is represented by red, blue, and green. I tend to think of it like Pokemon, so Snivy beats Oshawott beats Tepig beats Snivy. In this instance, the mages and mercenaries are wielding Tepigs against Rinkah's Snivy. And while it doesn't give them super effective damage, it does mean that Rinkah's hit rates are going to be incredibly shaky. But even if you, for some reason, don't care about consistently seeing 70 and 80% hit rates, the mercenaries and dark mages will be hitting Rinkah quite hard. The dark mages target res, completely ignoring her high defense stat, and as a result of that, her low HP is even more of a detriment than it would usually be. Meanwhile, the paired up mercenaries are fast enough to double Rinkah, although she can get a speed boost from Kaze pair up in order to bypass this issue. Regardless though, the shaky hit rates are a huge problem if Rinkah's trying to get kills, because frequently missing will mean either dying herself or allowing Corrin to get killed, causing you a game over. Technically, Branch of Fate units don't actually die when they are killed. Instead, they retreat and rejoin you in the main campaign at their base stats. But if the reason we're feeding Rinkah all of these kills is to try to bolster her base performance, then her dying to missing an 85% is going to end up with all of that effort wasted, since she doesn't get to keep the extra stats that she gained during chapters 4 and 5. And honestly, this chapter feels like it was designed to teach you how well Rinkah and Kaze work together, specifically putting Rinkah as the backpack, because the extra defense and strength actually enable Kaze quite a lot, and his performance on this map is quite good. He has 1-2 range, meaning he can actually counter the dark mages on enemy phase, and his resistance means they'll be dealing a lot less damage to him than they would be Rinkah or any of your other units. Not only that, but shurikens represent the blue area of the triangle, so Kaze is able to leverage the power of Oshawott against all of the Tepig wielding foes. And Kaze is actually fast enough at base to double the dark mages, when accounting for the speed boost he gets from his shurikens. As a result of this, his bulk is better than it appears on paper, because every combat with dark mages will net him a solid 3 ticks of guard gauge. And if he gets a single point of speed in chapter 4 leading up to chapter 5, then he'll also be able to double the unpaired mercenaries, which means that he will gain 3 points of guard gauge from combat with almost every enemy on the map. This allows him to do good damage on enemy phase and then secure kills on player phase, oftentimes uncountered, and kind of naturally funnels the EXP towards him and away from Rinkah. Of course, you can swim against the tide if you really want to make Rinkah work, as I did in my most recent playthrough. But you can probably tell from the footage that's been playing in the background that these hit rates are, well, let's just call them less than ideal. And frequently, I ran into situations where if Rinkah missed a 70 or 80%, I was looking at a reset. I would say the fact that this happened at all is unacceptable, but the fact that it happened almost 10 times in a single chapter is enough to make me discount training Rinkah in chapter 5 in its entirety. No, if we're trying to give Rinkah Branch of Fate's experience, we're going to have to look towards chapter 4, which is admittedly better for her. There's no weapon triangle present on this map, so the Faceless do as good or as bad against everyone on your team. And Rinkah's physical bulk is quite useful. She can up it by standing on terrain, and the Faceless all hit on defense. They're also all one range locked, so she can actually effectively enemy phase them. But you do still run into a few problems. The first is that you have a much more limited source of healing in Chapter 4 than you did in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 has Sakura with a 20-use Festal, but in Chapter 4, your only sources of healing are the Vulnerary that starts in Kaze's inventory, and the concoction Corrin can get from talking to Hinoko. Not only does this place a much lower cap on the total amount of damage a single unit can take, but it also means that anytime you require healing, you need to spend your player phase action using a healing item, instead of being able to attack and get healed by Sakura, which further limits EXP funneling opportunities. Many of the enemies also carry seal skills. Each of these seal skills will target a specific stat, such as seal strength targeting strength, seal speed targeting speed, etc. After you finish a round of combat with a unit who has a seal skill, your unit will lose 6 points in the given stat, and these points will recover at a rate of 1 per turn, thus making it harder for you to juggernaut and encouraging you to switch up which units are seeing combat so that the others can recover their sealed stats. theoretically you could simply retreat and wait around for the stats to recover to normal, but that is a recipe for having Ryoma steal all of your experience. Not only that, but if you want to make Chapter 5 a whole lot easier for you, it's advantageous to feed Kaze at least one level worth of kills. And the reason for that is he has an 85% speed growth, and as I mentioned, if he gains a point of speed, he can double the mercenaries, opening up significantly more strategies in increasing his bulk and damage output. So while Rinkah's performance is better in Chapter 4 than it is in Chapter 5, it's definitely not on the same level as Kaze in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 Kaze just naturally juggernauts and vacuums up all of the EXP, whereas Chapter 4 Rinkah is one of the 3 units performing about the same as each other. And the map's mechanics make it quite difficult to juggernaut and vacuum EXP into a single unit. You can still do this, and in fact, I do have a Branch of Fate file where I funneled as much experience as possible into Rinkah. The end result for me was a level 7 Rinkah with 90-ish experience, although she did miss out on the Chapter 4 boss kill as her HP was too low to attack without dying on counter. So theoretically, I probably could have avoided killing a regular enemy with her in order to instead kill the boss, bringing me up to roughly level 8.5 if I had to guesstimate. It's certainly not nothing, but I would say for the amount of work as well as low hit rate attacks that I had to do, it's really not worth the trouble. Branch of Fate's design just makes it much easier to feed experience to Kaze than it does to Rinkah. And at the risk of being controversial, I honestly think it's better to feed Kaze kills than Rinkah kills regardless of what route you're going. In Conquest, the reason for this is obvious. You don't even get access to Rinkah on this route. But I would argue the same is true on Rev and Birthright. In Rev, Kaze is a pretty essential unit for the early game. But even if you're playing Birthright, where Rinkah is one of the best units in the cast and Kaze is amongst the worst, I would still say that giving Kaze some levels in Branch is going to do more for you than Rinkah. Kaze's early game performance getting a bit of a boost will be helpful not only for clearing the early game Birthright maps, but also for weakening enemies to set up kills for the projects you want to train, especially if you get him Poison Strike early on. Meanwhile, Rinkah, even at base, has very good matchups in Chapter 7 of Birthright, allowing her to quite easily gain both experience and weapon rank, which she can carry forward into the rest of the campaign to snowball into one of your carries. I'd just much rather start the Oni training arc when I have weapon triangle advantage or neutrality and don't risk getting a game over upon missing. But okay, let's say we bit the bullet and decided to train Rinkah in Branch of Fate, reliability be damned. How does our level 7 or 8 Rinkah compare to the enemies on her join map? Well, like I said, it does improve her bulk by stopping her from getting doubled by the ninjas specifically, but she goes from being 2-rounded by enemies to being 3-rounded by enemies. The ninjas still debuff her defenses, and the Oni, Archer, and Spear Fighters still hit hard enough that even if she got lucky and procced her 65% defense growth every level up, she would still be taking 10 damage from the Archers, 8 damage from the Oni, 7 damage from the Spear Fighters, and 8 damage from the Samurai, who will double her for a total of 16 unless she procced speed 3 times. Rinkah is far from the only unit who faces durability problems in Chapter 9, but considering that she's supposed to be the Armor Knight of Hoshido, this is a pretty bad performance. And her strength is likely to level less than her defense, which means that even with Fiery Blood active, she's going to be 4 or 5 rounding enemies in exchange. Sakura, we need your healing! This combat is definitely not unworkable. In fact, I've trained base Rinkah in Chapter 9. But if you're just trying to beat the map, Rinkah is going to do surprisingly little for you on the front lines. She can wall pretty effectively with a Gunter pair-up, but there's only one Gunter to go around, and everyone can make use of Gunter well on this map. Even Hana, although it won't be for walling, it'll be for bolstering her offense. Okay, so technically, I guess Sakura doesn't make good use of Gunter, but that's only if you leave her in Shrine Maiden. If you've decided to reclass her into Sky Knight to train her Lance rank or just get another flying unit, then she does actually make good use of Gunter pair-up. Is she the best candidate for Gunter pair-up? No, but like, everyone wants Gunter pair-up. It's not like Rinkah is automatically getting Gunter pair-up. Although speaking of everyone wanting Gunter pair-up, Rinkah herself can actually be quite the contributor in Chapter 9, even if you didn't bother training her in Branch of Fate. And that is because she offers phenomenal pair-up bonuses. Because even though she can't have built supports with anyone yet, Oni Savage gives 4 strength and 2 defense. This is especially appreciated by Kaze, as he can have a bit of a noodle arm and often doubles, resulting in him taking advantage of the 4 strength twice. But honestly, any physical unit who's doing a significant amount of combat in Chapter 9 appreciates Rinkah pair-up. I usually put her on Jacob if I'm having him choke a point on his own, although Tsubaki also appreciates the boost, and heck, even Korin gets something out of it, although usually not as much as you would from Forceful Partner. And if you do want to continue the route of just using Rinkah as a backpack, the personal stats that she gives also complement the Oni line quite nicely. She gives a point of defense at C, a point of speed at B, a point of strength at A, and a point of speed and defense at S, leading to a grand total of 5 strength, 4 defense, and 2 speed. Not bad for any physical attacker. And if you feed her enough to promote to Oni, then she can add an additional 2 points of defense on top of that for 5 strength, 6 defense, and 2 speed. As a bonus, this also gives her the level 10 Oni skill Shove, which lets her push a unit 1 tile away from her in whatever direction she's facing. This can be situationally useful, and if she's just on backpack duty anyway, no reason not to load her up with niche utility skills. You never know when they might come up. If you're looking for the easiest way to get some value out of Rinkah, then this is probably it. Get her married to a physical unit who wants to frontline, and have her on permanent backpack duty. But this would be a pretty boring video if I said you want to use Rinkah, just make her a backpack. And she's not unsalvageable, no one in Fates is. Not only that, but if you are willing to put in the time and effort, Rinkah can be quite a potent member of your army at certain points in the campaign. But Chapter 9 is a very bad first impression. And as a result of that, I don't think you should try training Rinkah in Chapter 9. Instead, I think that a long-term Rinkah should be trying to gain experience in Chapter 10. Rinkah's matchups against the Chapter 10 enemies are not significantly better than they are in Chapter 9. In fact, the mercenaries and dark mages are definitely worse for her than the majority of enemies in Chapter 9 were. But Rinkah can now take advantage of forges, meals, and tonics much more easily than she could during her join map. Not only that, but Chapter 10 is the infamous snow shoveling map, which means all of the enemies start buried under the ice and are freed by the player at whatever pace you choose. While Chapter 9 has wind that stops you from taking things slowly, Chapter 10's gimmick instead almost forces you to engage enemies 1 or 2 at a time. As a result of this, I tend to think of Chapter 10 as a training map. Usually I use it as an opportunity to train up either Sakura, Mozu, or Hayato, but Rinkah is just as capable of achieving kills on isolated enemies. And even if she starts somewhat underleveled, because of the way Fates' experience system works, underleveled units are able to catch up fairly quickly, so missing the EXP from Chapter 9 doesn't hurt her as much as you might expect it to. The biggest downside to using Chapter 10 as Rinkah's major training point is that it's going to take away from some of the experience you might want to give other units, as Chapter 10 actually has a deploy cut as compared to Chapter 9. You're only able to deploy a total of 6 units. Meanwhile, if you've recruited everyone available, there will be 11 units in your army. And Rinkah isn't the only one who might want to play catch-up on this map. Hayato just joined you, and he's potentially your first mage, and a very good candidate for experience. although there is potentially an argument to delay his training until 11 so he can take advantage of pride against those enemies. But even if you're not training Hayato, Tsubaki, Hana, and even Kaze appreciate some more experience. And if you reclassed Sakura with the Heart Seal Fuga drops, then she also wants to build experience and lance rank. Mozu and Kaze are probably decently leveled if you used them in the previous map, but this might be the opportunity to get them a few more levels before an early promotion, since this map drops a Master Seal, the first one you don't have to purchase for yourself. And speaking of promoted units, Jacob and Felicia can potentially use this map to squeeze out the last few levels they need for a level 15 skill, especially useful if you're trying to pass one down to their child soon, since this is around the earliest that children can get recruited. You could technically have Dwyer, Shigure, or Kana available for this map, but personally I would recommend against grabbing any of the three of them for the snow shoveling map. Even if you want to early recruit a child, Chapter 11 is the earliest that I would say it is reasonable to add them to your team, since the deploy cut in Chapter 10 makes bringing enough first generation units feel like an arduous task. All that is to say, I don't think Rinkah is the best choice to feed experience in Chapter 10. But if you want to use Rinkah, then feeding her experience in Chapter 10 is probably the best way to do it. So with her training arc out of the way, what do we end up with? Well, Rinkah becomes a unit who is able to tank physical enemies quite well due to her very high defense stat. However, her resistance stat is going to leave her lacking. And unfortunately, her bulk is held back by the fact that she has a pretty low HP pool. You get one of every stat booster in Chapter 10, and I would personally recommend always giving the Seraph Robe to Rinkah if you are planning on using her. She needs the HP help that badly. Because enemy stat thresholds are so much higher in Revelation than the other two routes, I tend to think it's best to tackle problems offensively, by attacking on player phase as opposed to trying to fight on enemy phase. However, there are a few units who can leverage their bulk in order to effectively enemy phase. And I would say that a trained Rinkah is one of them, at least during the mid-game stretch. Especially when faced with enemies like ninjas and samurai who are threatening because of their power to double rather than their high strength, Rinkah's high defense can cause her to stand up to a significant amount of punishment, especially if she is given an early promotion to Oni Chieftain. This can allow her to successfully bait and chip and potentially even wall large groups of enemies, depending on the map layout. Chapters 11 and 13 are of particular note because of these scary ninjas who can threaten your other enemies at 1-2 range, but anywhere where there are large groups of physical enemies, a promoted trained Rinkah is going to be useful. Rinkah is still not going to be dealing the best damage in the world thanks to her shaky strength stat, but considering the amount of punishment that Rinkah can stand up to, it's generally fine for her to only 3 or 4 round enemies, provided that she can choke a point and take them on herself. When the maps get more open, this is a little bit more problematic, although there are still a few ways that you can bolster Rinkah's damage output. The first of them is of course her personal skill, Fiery Blood. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but it gives her a +4 boost to her attacking stat as long as she's not at full HP. This is harder to leverage in the early game when Rinkah is still getting going, because at the stage of the game where enemies are 2 or 3 rounding her, she constantly wants to keep her HP topped up so that she can do these enemy phase gamings. But once you get her defense to the point where most enemies are dealing single digit, as well as bolstering her HP, potentially with the Seraph Robe, Rinkah can regularly make use of Fiery Blood for multiple turns in a row. And if you choose to send her in the Oni Chieftain line, then it is notable that the +4 damage is not just physical damage, but also applies to any magical attacks that Rinkah makes, as that class gains access to tomes and has a decent magic stat. Rinkah's magic is in a weird place, where it is worse than any of the actual dedicated mages, but generally better than the magic stat of all the physical units, except for Camilla and Oboro, because they're just built different. In combination with native access to the Seal Resistance skill, which reduces enemies' res by 6 after a round of combat with them, Rinkah's magical combat can be surprisingly decent. And in the Birthright route, this makes a magical focus one of her more potent tools. If you're interested in that, I would highly recommend watching Bad at Life's video on the topic, which will be linked in the description. In general, Rev enemy bulk is going to be too high for Rinkah to achieve the same heights that she did in Birthright. However, magic can still be useful for her when attacking high defense enemies, such as other Oni or even armored enemies. Moreover, tomes give Rinkah access to 1-2 range, and a greater control over the weapon triangle than if she had to focus on axes. Although speaking of axes, there is a magical axe, the Bolt Axe, which you can use if you want to push Mage Rinkah to her limits. The iconic Zero Magic Berserker drops one in Chapter 19, and because Rinkah has an actual magic stat and axe rank, she's one of the better users of it. However, if you want to get going with Bolt Axe gaming sooner, you can purchase one from the level 2 weapon shop in Chapter 14 or beyond. But before you get too excited about the return of Mage Rinkah, bear in mind that she is competing for this limited resource with Camilla, and Camilla's a pretty good unit in case you didn't know. Malignite Camilla is going to have a higher magic stat than Oni Chieftain Rinkah, and she has a higher growth, so you can't even cope that it's better on Rinkah in the long term. You could just hashtag use both once you get the Bolt Axe from Chapter 19, but until then, Camilla and Rinkah are fighting over a one-of-a-kind resource, and in situations like that, Camilla is usually going to win. But even beyond that, just purchasing the Bolt Axe in Chapter 14 is a pretty huge gold expense. 3,300 gold is a hefty price tag. And at the same time the Bolt Axe becomes available, you also have the opportunity to buy more seals, effective weapons like the Hammer, Hunter's Knife, and Beast Killer, Reaver weapons like the Dual Naginata or Calamity Gate, and the Horse Spirit. Honestly, it's hard enough to justify purchasing the Bolt Axe for Camilla. Getting it just for Rinkah's personal weapon is a whole nother ballpark of favoritism. Still, even if you aren't able to achieve the kill power with Rinkah that you could with other units, being able to achieve such high bulk is something unique and admirable in and of itself. Chipping a bunch of people on enemy phase so that your other units can clean up on player phase is an appreciated task. And there's even several maps where Rinkah can just choke a point against primarily physical enemies. But the glory of high defense Rinkah doesn't last all the way into the end game, because late game Rev features a variety of enemies that Rinkah just does not match up well against. Firstly, Basara and Oni Chieftain become quite common, and these enemies can choose to hit either on defense or resistance. While Rinkah's defense stat is quite good, her resistance and HP are not. And as a result of this, taking on these hybrid enemies just does not work for her. They'll choose to use their tomes and absolutely obliterate her. But perhaps worse still, the enemy type that she used to be best against, ninjas, suddenly become one of her worst matchups, because any promoted units in Rev have the skills from their unpromoted classes. And as a result of this, Mechanists and Master Ninjas will pack the Poison Strike skill. Poison Strike means that whenever you initiate combat at the end of that round, your opponent will take 20% chip damage. This damage is always non-lethal, so Poison Strike will at least leave you at 1 HP. However, unless Rinkah is taking 0 from everything, Poison Strike from multiple ninjas will quickly wear her down to the point where any enemy can kill her, because, she only has 1 HP. There are still selective groups of enemies that Rinkah will be good at fighting on enemy phase, especially if given support from a pair-up Tonic and Rally. But these groups of enemies become less frequent the longer the game goes on. And not only that, I find that Rinkah's ability to soak up enemy hits and chip in retaliation gets a lot less desirable the later you go into the game. As your own army becomes more competent at one-rounding, being able to chip on enemy phase just isn't as impressive. As a result of this, once you enter Vala, even a trained Rinkah might slide into backpack duty. And honestly, I think that's an admirable retirement plan for her. I've always said that I value backpacks who are able to do combat on their own more than backpacks who are only able to backpack. And if Rinkah was carrying you through the mid-game, then putting her on backpack duty isn't necessarily going to keep her off the battlefield forever. Like I said, there's a select group of enemies that her stat spread is still good against, and if you run into one of those situations, you can switch her to the front and relive the glory days. Of course, while this is the most basic and, in my opinion, best use of Rinkah, there are, as with all Fates units, a number of silly builds that you can go into by abusing the support system. Rinkah has 4 friendship options: Orochi, Kagero, Oboro, and Charlotte. Kagero friendship is useless to Rinkah. Not only does she already have the ninja class, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, she really doesn't want to enter it. I suppose dipping for 1 level to grab Lock Touch is okay if you just have her on backpack duty, but I don't think it's worth spending 2 heart seals to get a Lock Touch user. I would much rather just use one of the ninjas or Shura. Heck, even adding Niles to the team is probably a better option than reclassing Rinkah. Orochi may on the surface appear to be as much of a non-starter as Kagero is, but because Rinkah has some magical aptitude anyway, it's not unreasonable for her to want to dip into the Diviner line to pick up a couple of skills. Magic +2 and Tome Fair are the standouts, as Magic +2 gives you an additional 2 magic, and Tome Fair gives you 5 more damage when using tomes. If Rinkah's magic weapon of choice is the Bolt Axe, then Magic +2 is the only one that will do anything, but if you're having her use Fire Tomes for triangle control, then Tome Fair will bolster her damage in that respect. It's never going to be enough to make Rinkah into a powerful enemy phase sweeper, but it is going to improve the chip damage that she does while tanking multiple hits. And if you're using Rinkah enough that it's reasonable to grab a level 15 skill, then this is probably a worthwhile investment. Although Diviner's other level 15 skill, Quixotic, does allow for some shenanigans. You see, Quixotic adds +30 to the hit rate of both yourself and the opponent, as well as +15% to any proc rates on either side. Although this is mostly one-sided, as the only enemy in main game Rev that has any proc skills is Iago, the boss of Chapter 17, who has Vengeance. The 15% to proc skills only applies to skills that happen in combat, so it won't affect things like Profiteer, Good Fortune, or Keaton's Collector skill. But there's a funny little quirk with the skill Salvage Blow. Salvage Blow gives you a luck % chance upon killing your opponent to get an iron copy of whatever weapon they were using, the Hoshiden variant though. So, for example, if you killed a maid with a steel dagger, then you will get a steel shuriken. Even though the display box for getting the item happens after the battle, the skill is technically checked upon you getting the kill, which still occurs during the battle. And because of this, Quixotic does affect Salvage Blow. If you want to make the most of Rinkah's combat, I would recommend going into Oni Chieftain instead of Blacksmith, but if you want to do funny luck-based gambling shenanigans, then sending Rinkah into Blacksmith in order to grab the skill Salvage Blow, and eventually into Basara in order to grab the skill Quixotic, will allow her to be a weapons factory. You could, of course, sell these weapons for 500 gold a pop, which is not a lot of money, or you could do something incredibly silly and forge yourself up high-rank weapons. The forges in Fates get exponentially more expensive. To get a level 1, you need to combine 2 items, but to get a level 2, you need to combine 4. A level 3 requires 8, and a level 4 requires 16, with it continuing to double until a level 7 forge, which requires 128 copies of the same weapon. Now, of course, using Salvage Blow to get over 100 copies of the same weapon is ridiculous, which is why there's almost certainly going to be someone in the comment section who claims they've done it. And no, abusing the Siegbert Paralog oversight doesn't count. You gotta do it the old-fashioned way. But even just being able to get a +3 or +4 is kind of ridiculous, and the combination of Quixotic and Salvage Blow can push you to that limit. Is it good? No. But is it funny? Yes. And as I say on this channel time and time again, oftentimes funny is better than good. Of course, Orochi is not the only unit who can give Rinkah the Basara class line. You could marry her to Hayato, or you could grab Basara via the Spearfighter tree, which is provided via Oboro friendship. And Spearfighter does potentially give access to another interesting and rather fun build that Rinkah can slot into, that being the Debuffbot. It's sort of the evil opposite of the Rallybot. Rallybot boosts your own unit's stats, but Debuffbot reduces the enemy's stats. Oni Savage naturally grants Rinkah access to Seal Resistance, which reduces the enemy's res by 6 after a combat, even if Rinkah doesn't do any damage to them. Heck, even if Rinkah doesn't even counterattack, simply being in combat with Rinkah will debuff their resistance by 6. However, the Spearfighter tree gets 2 more Seal skills, those being Seal Defense, which does the same thing to defense, and Seal Speed, which does, you guessed it, the same thing to speed. Notably, all 3 of these Seal skills affect an enemy's defensive stats, since Seal Speed allows more of your units to double them, and Seal Defense and Resistance allow your units to deal more damage. And so the general idea behind this build is you throw Rinkah out into a sea of enemies, have them all break themselves upon her, and then at the end of enemy phase, your units come in and clean up everyone who she has so neatly weakened for them. This can be especially nice if you're running a lot of off-meta builds on your team, as oftentimes those can either take longer to get going or struggle to reach the various high stat benchmarks that late game rev has to offer. If you're turning Rinkah into a debuff bot, then you might want to consider marrying one of the Samurai for Seal Strength, or marrying a Dark Mage Talent Cornet for Seal Marriage. Editing Danny here, I of course meant Seal Magic, but the outtake of Seal Marriage was too funny not to leave in the video, so this is just me saying Dark Mage gives Seal Magic, not Seal Marriage. But honestly, I don't think either of these are particularly useful. Strength and Magic are offensive stats, and generally the idea behind sealing your enemy's stats is you're going to weaken them for your other units to go in for the kill. As a result of this, debuffing offensive stats isn't a huge deal. It might be relevant if you are unable to avoid facing a counterattack, such as with enemy ninjas, and the units you're trying to get kills on are quite frail, but in general, I think that it would be more worthwhile to focus Rinkah's marriage in another area. And personally, I think if you're turning her into a debuff bot, then Benny is probably her best husband. He can give her either general access to further bolster her defenses and take on more enemies, or Great Knight to increase her movement while maintaining a strong defensive profile. And as a bonus, both of these classes allow Rinkah to maintain her axe rank, as long as she joins them while she's already promoted. The last friendship option that Rinkah has is Charlotte, and this is one that definitely benefits Charlotte much more than it does Rinkah. So Charlotte heads, make sure you subscribe and stay excited for that video. Yeah! But Rinkah can still get some benefit from access to the fighter class line. HP plus 5 is of course highly desirable. Rinkah wants every extra source of HP she can get. But going into the hero tree also potentially gives you Soul. Soul is a skill percent chance to recover HP equal to half of the damage you deal that rolls with every attack you land. And anyone who wants to play as a defensive wall should at least consider adding this to their toolkit. However, while Rinkah definitely has the skill stat to make Soul proc more often than not, her damage output is questionable at best. And as a result of this, every time that she procs Soul against an enemy, she would be recovering a paltry amount of HP. If you're just turning Rinkah into a generic tank, then it's possible you don't have 5 good skills for her. And if you're dipping for HP plus 5, there's an argument to just do the 2 extra levels in order to grab Soul as well, although make sure you unequip Gamble ASAP if you do that. But in general, if you're not already going Hero in order to grab the HP boost, then I wouldn't recommend getting Soul for Rinkah. Technically, Berserker also offers Axe Fair, which can help to boost Rinkah's damage output. As much like Tome Fair, this is a 5 damage stack, only the condition is for using axes. This will affect both the Bolt Axe and Rinkah's physical axes, so as a hybrid attacker, Rinkah will benefit on both sides of the spectrum from this skill. This definitely helps with Rinkah's damage output, as would remaining in the Berserker class. Not only for Berserker's higher strength modifier, but also for the potential ability to go into a crit build. Blacksmith gives Rinkah access to the Death Blow skill, which gives plus 20 crit whenever she's initiating combat. An innate trait of the Berserker class is to give plus 20 crit in every combat, whether you're initiating or on defense. This is also basically the only time you might consider adding Gamble to your kit, since this skill reduces your hit rate by 10, but in exchange gives you an extra 10 crit. You can combine this with a Killer Axe for an extra 25 crit, or the Great Club for an extra 45 crit to stack your crit rate to truly enormous levels. And as a bonus, when using one of these high crit rate weapons, your critical hits will deal 4 times damage instead of 3 times damage, further helping to offset Rinkah's paltry strength stat. While this build is incredibly fun, and I think quite popular amongst more casual players, I tend to dislike the crit builds. Killer weapons are pretty bad stat-wise, both in terms of their might and in terms of their hit rate. So when not scoring a critical hit, they're going to deal less damage than the bronze equivalent would. For a unit like Rinkah, this is especially detrimental because she's already struggling to output the damage she wants. There's also just a lot of ways to stack damage in Fire Emblem Fates, and as a result of this, it is almost always more beneficial to increase your damage stack than increase your crit stack. Sure, if you score a critical hit, then that will also increase your damage by quite a bit, but if you're spending your skill slots to increase your crit rate, and you're using a weapon that is subpar when not scoring critical hits, I find that overall your combats are going to be worse than if you had just focused on damage. Another reason that crit builds are commonly unpopular is that critical hits can mess with guard gauge math. Although I would argue that for most of the units that want these crit builds, guard gauge is not a huge factor. They're trying to be offensive glass cannons, as opposed to defensive tanks. But that's another reason that Rinkah probably shouldn't go into a crit build. She wants to enemy phase. She's got bulk. It's the big thing she has going for her. So ultimately, I think whether you're staying in Berserker for the extra damage or the extra crit rate, it's detrimental for a similar reason to the Ninja reclass. It gives Rinkah something that she doesn't super care about while taking away her greatest strength, her uniquely powerful bulk. If you are dead set on turning Rinkah into a crit-focused Berserker, however, then I would recommend making sure you can access the Basara class line. That way you can grab the Quixotic skill in order to add those plus 30 hit that she's going to desperately need if she uses either the Great Club or the Killer Axe. Conveniently, Rinkah is able to access both Berserker and Basara through either Friendship or Marriage. So, it's not going to get in the way of your pairings too much to ensure that she gets both of these class lines. Fighter comes from either Charlotte Friendship or Keaton Marriage, whereas Basara can come from either her Oboro Friendship or Orochi Friendship, or Hayato Marriage. But on the topic of marriages, I should probably dive into Rinkah's potential spouses, because she's able to get more than just Quixotic from whoever she marries. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I think Rinkah's best marriage option is her cross route with Benny. This gives her the general class, which can further supplement her bulk. She doesn't really care about any of the skills that the Knight line offers, although the two unpromoted ones, Defense plus 2 and Natural Cover, can be nice. Defense plus 2 just gives you 2 more defense, and Natural Cover reduces damage you take by 3 if you are on a space with a terrain effect. Late game Rev is pretty devoid of terrain tiles, but you can occasionally find a fort or staircase or woods tile to park yourself in if you need to reduce damage even more. I find that Rinkah is fast enough that she really doesn't need Wary Fighter, and oftentimes it can actually slow her down, because there's a decent number of enemies that she will naturally double. Although do bear in mind that your mileage may vary depending on how early you reclass into the Nightline, as it does cut down on her speed base and growth. But the main advantage from marrying Rinkah to Benny is the two of them actually work quite well together. Both Knight and Oni Chieftain give significant bulk bonuses on pair-up, and Rinkah and Benny's personal pair-up stats supplement these bonuses as well. They're also both characters who can struggle in the damage dealing department, yet are quite good at soaking up physical hits. And as a result of this, if you're using Benny and Rinkah, they kind of naturally want to fight the same sets of foes, meaning that either in pair-up or attack stance, they usually end up in the same place anyway. I tend to think that more defensive units prefer guard stance as opposed to attack stance, and Benny and Rinkah can do the thing that I've talked about, where you have two competent units act as backpacks to each other. That way they can switch between who's frontlining depending on who's low on HP or specific matchups. Honestly, if you're going for this marriage just to have two big walls, I would consider not reclassing Rinkah at all. Sure, General does increase her physical bulk, but she loses out on tome access and some magic damage even if she uses the bolt axe. It's not like she's going to be significantly worse as a general than she would be as an Oni Savage, but if you have other high investment units on your team, then spending a heart seal for a side grade rather than an upgrade is generally not the best thing to do. Of course, if you don't want to use Benny or are simply pairing him with someone else, then Rinkah has a couple of other decent marriage candidates. It's always worth considering Samurai Marriage on a unit who wants to frontline, as Vantage is a good bulk supplementing skill. It means that if you are 50% or lower HP, you will attack first, potentially killing enemies before they have the chance to kill you. And even if you don't kill them, it allows you to generate extra guard gauge before taking a hit. Although I will say I don't think this is as good on Rinkah as it is on other frontliners, since Rinkah gets a large amount of her bulk from the raw defense stat as opposed to HP. And as such, she oftentimes doesn't end up below the 50% threshold that is required to have Vantage be active. And even in situations where she has Vantage online, her damage output is generally low enough that it can be difficult to set up situations where she kills people before they can attack her. If you do still want to grab Vantage, you have to choose between Hinata Marriage and Ryoma Marriage. Hinata Marriage comes sooner, so if all you care about is getting Vantage on Rinkah, that's probably the better option. However, Hinata already has access to the Oni line, and as a result of this, he doesn't really gain anything from the marriage. It does mean that his son, Hisame, gains access to the ninja class, which can be interesting if you are planning on using the Pickle Boy, but Hisame is not exactly the best Gen 2 unit, and I don't think the stats that Rinkah passes down are particularly desirable for him anyway. In fact, even outside of Hisame, I'd go so far as to say that Rinkah is one of the worst mothers in the cast, passing down speed, skill, and defense, but lowering everything else, including HP, is just not a great combination. The only child who could arguably benefit from this is Ignatius, since it allows him to get overkill defense in a similar manner to his father. But even then, Rinkah is going to be lowering his impressive strength and his HP stat, meaning that he's arguably not as bulky unless you get him to the point where he would be taking 0 from all enemies anyway. And Ignatius doesn't even necessarily need to lean into the defensive role. There's plenty of things he can do outside of the Armor Knight class line. But I got off on a little bit of a tangent there. Back on topic, Samurai Rinkah. If you're willing to leave Rinkah as a bachelorette until Ryoma shows up, then this pairing can potentially be beneficial to your Generation 1 units. Ryoma is one of the few cast members who actually appreciates access to the Oni line, as this grants access to the Blacksmith class, which allows him to retain Rajinto while dipping for skills, specifically the level 15 skill Lancebreaker, which grants plus 50 hit and avoid if the opponent has a lance equipped. A not insignificant amount of Ryoma's bulk comes from his avoid stat, But when facing hidden weapons and lances, he ends up at triangle disadvantage and faces really high hit rates, significantly limiting the number of enemies he can safely take on. Lancebreaker turns the tables on the scary lance enemies, making it much easier for Ryoma to take on hordes of foes with relatively little risk to himself. Ryoma and Rinkah also work together fairly decently, although it's for a different reason than her working well with Benny. Ryoma appreciates the bulk and strength boosts that he gets from Rinkah, because his speed doesn't really need fixing, so it's the other physical stats that you want to focus on. If Rinkah is a lower level than Ryoma, he'll also gain an extra boost from Bushido being active. This is enough of a selling point if you aren't training Rinkah and just have her on backpack duty, but if you are planning on having her frontline, then the fact she and Ryoma take on different sets of foes can enable them to, in guard stance, tear through entire maps. Ryoma wants to take on frailer enemies like mages, since he can quite reasonably one-shot them with Vantage. Meanwhile, Rinkah appreciates fighting physical foes, because even if she's not dealing much damage to them, they aren't dealing much damage to her. This makes her particularly adept at taking on the ninjas that Ryoma has trouble avoiding, since not only can she leverage triangle advantage over them, but she can also shrug off their fairly low might fast attacks. As a result of this, if you just want to have these two cruise through a group of enemies, you can switch who's in the front depending on what foes you are facing next. The last marriage I would recommend for a bulk-focused Rinkah is Azama, as the Shrine Maiden line will give her access to the Renewal skill, passively recovering 30% of her HP at the start of every turn. If you just want to throw her out into a group of enemies, then being able to passively recover HP can allow her to take on more foes without requiring any healing. Although, I'll be honest, this feels like it's better in theory than in practice, for a couple of reasons. First off, Azama comes very late, so you're going to be delaying Rinkah's marriage, and unlike with Ryoma, Azama isn't exactly a high-value spouse. But even once you get Renewal, it's important to remember that Rinkah's max HP is one of her weak points, and so 30% of a low number is still going to be a relatively low number, meaning that the amount of self-sustain you get from Renewal is quite questionable. If you're at a low enough HP that you are at risk from enemies, just popping 2 or 3 extra points isn't going to be doing much for your game plan. But perhaps the saddest thing that can happen if you equip Renewal onto Rinkah is it can recover her up to full HP when she only has a little bit of damage. A slightly damaged Rinkah is at no risk of dying, but a slightly damaged Rinkah gets to take advantage of Fiery Blood for the extra 4 damage. If Renewal takes her out of Fiery Blood range, then you've really just lowered your damage output for no upside. And Shrine Maiden doesn't really offer much else in the way of useful skills. Even if you want to grab Tome Fair from Omnioji, it's probably preferable to do it via Diviner so you can also get +2 magic. I guess in theory I should talk about counter magic. It means that if you get attacked by anyone using magic, they will deal back the equivalent damage to themselves. Because Rinkah is quite weak to magic, counter magic is going to deal a non-insignificant chunk to any mages she engages with. But at the same time, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where a wall like Rinkah is taking large chunks of damage. It's better off to just have her avoiding mages rather than engaging with them. That's all for the bulky Rinkah marriages, but if you are going for the degenerate crit build, then Takumi is someone worth considering, since Sniper gives access to Certain Blow, which grants a +40 hit boost on player phase, in order to make up for the terrible hit rates of Killer Axe and Great Club. Rinkah is the only Gen 1 unit who has access to Sniper, Berserker, and Blacksmith at the same time without Corrin's assistance, which is definitely a relevant factor if you're looking to go into the crit Berserker build. Personally, I would still prefer to focus on Rinkah's defense instead of her offense, but if this is the sort of thing that you're into, it is an option you can take advantage of. The last class line Rinkah can access through marriage that I haven't mentioned is Sky Knight, and this doesn't really do much for her. Camaraderie is basically a worse version of Renewal, with all the same problems that Renewal brings. Darting Blow can push her over some speed thresholds if you're focusing on the player phase, But Rinkah's best player phase build is crit focused, and for that you really want to get as many crit boosting and accuracy boosting skills. Using your marriage for Skydite means that you can't access both Berserker and one of Basara or Sniper. And besides, doubling doesn't super matter if you're just going to crit anyways. And while Kinshi itself is an incredibly valuable class, Rinkah just does not have the stats to make it work. It doesn't do anything to fix her strength issues, and actually ends up making them much worse. No, if you want to get Rinkah airborne, then I would say she needs Corrin Marriage, specifically for the Wyvern line. Wyvern allows Rinkah to retain her bulk and her axe rank while giving her flight and higher mobility. Not only that, but if she chooses to go the Malik route instead of the Wyvern Lord route, then she retains her decent magic stat, and can still do bolt axe strategies. And this basically makes her just as good of a unit as Camilla, right? Right? I mean, don't compare their stats. That's not relevant or important. Rinkah's Camilla tier, right? Jokes aside, even though Wyvern is one of the better routes for Rinkah, I don't think it's worth spending your Corrin Marriage to buff up a unit with as poor prospects as her. Corrin Marriage is a one-of-a-kind and incredibly valuable resource. In my opinion, approaching every unit as if they've been given this extreme form of favoritism is just not a productive way to talk about the cast. And it also makes the units a lot less interesting to discuss. Like, if I was factoring Corrin Marriage into every single video, then most of them would just involve me saying the best build for this character is to give them Wyvern or Kinshi depending on their stat spread. And at that point, why bother having an hour-and-a-half video on every single unit in the cast? Even that one. One of the reasons that I find these unit deep dives much more fascinating for a game like Fates than something like Engage or Three Houses is the limitations that you get, I think, breed a lot more unit identity than those games. Engage is especially guilty of this, with the cast feeling like a very homogeneous blob, but even Three Houses, with its boons, banes, and combat arts, makes the unit distinctions feel a lot less extreme than the specific class routing and friendships that Fates offers. As far as ranking the units goes, I think I'd put Rinkah in low C tier, although I can honestly see a potential argument for high D. Whether it comes before the Branch of Fate or afterwards, Rinkah's training arc is always going to be somewhat rough. And while the payoff for training her is unique does not always mean good. Things like the debuff build or the certain blow death blow combination can be fun, and if you're a huge fan of Rinkah, I would definitely recommend trying him. But as far as her prospects as a physical tank, well, when you're trying to fill a niche and find yourself outclassed by Benny, you know you did something wrong. As such, I honestly think the biggest boon that Rinkah offers in Rev is her ability to be a phenomenal physical backpack for others who want to frontline. Without Corrin Backpack, you lack access to an early fighter, and as such, Oni is the primary way of bolstering strength through a pair-up. While the combination of strength and defense is, at least in my opinion, worse than combining strength and speed, it is still valuable, and there are certain units who can take advantage of it, in particular your hidden weapon users, who are fast enough already. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments how you feel about Rinkah in the Rev route. Have you ever used her? And if so, how did you get around the many downsides the developers programmed in? Do any of the unique build options sound fun to you? And of course, while you're down there, make sure you include today's comment code word, BOTTOM. That way I know you made it to the end of the video. And now, it's time to thank my patrons. Thank you to Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smazruby, Zycrum, Robin D, Girlboss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, a clever username of lies, YLO1, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Floahay, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Toaster But Really, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Belle Wenska, Dysike, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Gabe the Green, Control Dasius, Roman Kormancic, Knick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, and Some Trades. And a big special double thank you to my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey, and Lilzabeth. If you are interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel are of course free ways that you can support me, but regardless of what you do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.